My name is Jaime, and I work for the MidPointe Library System. I'm one of the library specialists. I tend to be at most locations at some point. And today we are going to be creating a watercolor landscape. Now, since this is going to be pretty much for basics, but if you are familiar enough with it, feel free to experiment as well, or take this idea a little further. Watercolor is one of those things where it works best if you have watercolor paper. You could try on copy paper, but you're definitely not going to have as much mix as you're going to like. The colors are really going to bog down the paper and it could potentially break. And watercolor paper is made to absorb some of that water and make it so that it doesn't fall apart. And this watercolor paper is Canson watercolor. It's one of my favorites. It's pretty thick and nice and dense. There are some watercolor papers out there that are a lot thinner, similar to copy paper. I just prefer to have it a little thicker so it can handle the water. And today I wanted to use a reference picture from a website I've mentioned before called Pexels. And Pexels.com is free images that are copyright free. And this photographer had a beautiful image. I really liked this, that it could be something simple. Because a lot of using watercolor is trying to build your color slowly at a time, because you can always start light to dark, but it's hard to go from dark to light, and it can make it really kind of difficult, and you don't want it to be stressful for you. So if you have trouble with watercolor, or if you've used it in the past, just don't worry about it. It's okay if it doesn't look like mine. This is all practice. The watercolor palette I'm using, it's not in a tube. This is just a dry palette that is made by Crayola, because some of you guys may not have a ton of cash to break out for some of those expensive Sakura watercolor palettes that are like $40 and actually have less colors. But you really don't need a ton of colors to create stuff. It's just about knowing your color theory and learning how to mix your colors, because what we'll end up basing our image off of is this, and we'll start with the yellow and build from there. So if you know that this is sort of orangey, yellow and red create your orange. If you're ever confused about colors, you could always buy your own color wheel. This particular color wheel is for helping you to mix colors. So if you had green and you're adding blue, it kind of shows you approximately the color it should look like. Blue, green, adding white to it, what it would look like. Just kind of gives you some ideas. But there's also other videos on YouTube talking about color theory and mixing colors that will help you. And other than that, experiment with it yourself. Do swatch palettes where you just use some red, add the orange together, see what colors it makes. Make little notes on it saying, I've added red plus orange, this is what it looks like. Because every palette, even if it's not watercolor or and tube paint, they're going to look different. And they're going to look different depending on your piece. So with this reference picture, we're just getting a basic idea. I'm going to kind of draw darkly with a pencil at first, but I really want to keep it light, so I'll draw it dark so you can see it, and then I'll erase some of the lines. But when you're drawing with your pencil, try to keep your lines real soft. But we'll start about in the middle on the left side of your piece, and the very far mountain in this image doesn't have a whole lot of bumps. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Just get kind of the same idea that that image has within your piece. And then there's sort of this more reddish mountain, because a lot of times you may not have something like this outside your window out in your yard, so you may want to have a reference image to go by just as a starting point. We can't always do it by, or at least I personally can never do it but from memory or just making it up. And then you kind of have this darker area of mountains. We'll start on the right. And I'm really just doing little bumpy, irregular lines. I'm trying to have different heights and highs and lows, different kind of shapes, and hopefully you can see that okay. Because again, you don't have to make exactly the way I'm doing it. And there's this kind of other mountain range that's in between your foreground. That's kind of two little bumps and then it just disappears. So then in the very foreground, we'll start that really dark mountain. It starts real high, then it's kind of steep, drops down almost to the bottom of your page. Then we'll move it back up. Feel free to do this little guy, but at the moment I'm not worried about him. And let it pop up a little, but your higher points on the left side. So hopefully you can see that okay, because then I'm going to lighten it up. A kneaded eraser would probably be best for this, but I love white erasers. And I'm just going to make it real light because watercolor, especially when you're trying to keep your paint rather light and build the color, the graphite from the pencil can mix with it and can dirty up your yellow. But I wanted you to be able to see kind of where you wanted to lay your colors down. Because with this, like I said, with color theory, knowing what colors mix will change the way your mountains look. So if we just colored this whole thing yellow, that very top portion of the picture that's blue would start turning kind of green, and we're going to try to avoid that, avoid the greenness. Okay, so I've got mine pretty well erased, enough that I can see it, but you guys probably wouldn't be able to see it very well, so I didn't want to make you guys guess what I was drawing at the beginning. But what we'll start with, I like going from a lighter color to a darker color. So since the lightest color, and yellow always tends to be the one that gets real dirty in these palettes, especially if you have kids that use these, most likely this will be green in your palette. And so anything that you have in the palette, you want to try to keep as clean as possible. And if you have a thing that's like this case, a lot of times this portion is a mixing tray. So you can always mix your colors up here without touching any of these, because you want to keep this as pure as possible. And watercolor, of course, activates with water. So if you have trouble spreading, you definitely want to add more water to your brush. Since we have a large expanse to kind of cover at the moment, I'm going to just use one of my square brushes. It's called a half, but depending on what kind of brush, if you get the really cheap ones, they may not tell you a number at all. But just get a good size brush, because something like this is more for detail work, and your not wanting to paint a barn with it. So we're wanting to try to cover as much ground as possible. So wet your brush, get some of your yellow, load it onto your brush. And it may be a little hard to see, but up in here behind this mountain range, we definitely want it to be yellow. But I'm going to let it come down a little bit within our mountain range, because if you've noticed in this picture, the very far back mountain range is more orange. And to try to use fewer colors, because if you were experimenting and wanted to get like the watercolor tube, color theory wise, you would really only need primary colors, which is your red, yellow, and blue. And then that way it gives you a chance to experiment with your paints without spending a boatload of money. Because really those three colors can mix, like red and yellow create your oranges. Red and blue will create your purples. Blue and yellow will create your greens. And all three together would be able to give you kind of a real dark, sometimes almost looks a little more green, depending on how much of one color you have mixed in. You could always mix green, mix a green and then add a little bit of red to get a really nice brown. So you don't have to have a ton of colors. Like this palette just happens to have more colors than you really need. But I've grabbed the yellow, and since this mountain is going to be kind of on the orangey side, I want you to kind of learn how to mix a little bit on your piece. So we'll add a little more water to my brush, even though I had color, and brush into some of that first mountain range in the very back. But I also want it to go up into the sky, because you've seen where the sun's kind of dropped down behind the mountains and really made this beautiful gold color. And like I said, if you have trouble pushing color, and you'll notice I'm kind of keeping it a little on the light side and just adding a little more color. If it's not moving, you need to add more water. Yes, it does deplete the color a little bit, makes it lighter, but that's okay. You can always add more. And you can draw a pretty straight line if you want, but don't feel like you have to. Our sky really does change and have a lot of, really rarely has straight lines. If you see a straight line, it's typically a trail from a plane. And so you don't really want to be super perfect in a sky. Because I do notice that a lot of people who paint or start painting, when they do skies, they just go straight across. Try to mix it up a little. Okay, so I've gone a little bit into that other mountain range with that yellow. And then I'm gonna grab some of the red, because when it mixes on top of this yellow in the mountain range, it's gonna look more orange. And if it doesn't pull real orange at first, you can always mix more of an orange or come back in with a little bit more yellow on top. Because since I'm painting pretty light, it's not really making a very strong orange color, but I'm wanting to keep it soft originally, at least, to allow me to build my color. And remember, if you have trouble getting the paint to move, just add more water. But it's really a control thing, learning how to control how much water. I'm grabbing a little more yellow because I want it to be a little deeper in here, and I noticed when I added water, it started separating the color. But if you ever get too much water like that, just grab a paper towel and it'll help suck up some of that extra water. And it's really about learning control in stuff like this. Learning to control how much paint you're getting, how much water you're putting down. And some people, every watercolorist works a little differently. Some will spritz their dry palette with some water first to just get it wet initially, so they're not having to add so much water with their brush, because sometimes the brush can really waterlog the palette. So you could just spritz some water on if you really wanted to. But allow your brush to just do the same thing like your pencil and do a ragged line, because there's trees and different vegetation up in the mountain range that isn't real easy to see, but it does affect the shape of the mountain. But just keep adding a little, like, you don't want to get so much red on your brush that it overwhelms the whole piece. And like I said, you can always, if it kind of startles you at how red it is, just wipe off your brush, clean it, and grab some of the yellow and go over top of it. It's going to be easier to adjust and work with while it's wet than if you waited for it to dry, because the more you mess with watercolor, the less forgiving it is, unfortunately. But it's one of those things that you really just have to play with and learn how to work with. That's why I really do push for people to buy just a Crayola dry palette, because it gives you a chance to work with watercolor the way watercolor does work without spending a bundle of money, because not everyone has that. And especially if you do this whole thing and you go, I hate watercolor, then you're not out of a bunch of money and kind of miserable for it and couldn't believe that you just spent $40 on a really expensive palette. I'm going back into the yellow and making it a little wet, because I want to add just a little bit of red, and since I don't want it to be too dominant, I'm just going to hit it on my paper towel a little bit until I notice it's light, and then I'll dip my brush back into the water and just brush it along that top portion of the yellow. And it'll be just super soft, because I want to keep it pretty light. In fact, I'm kind of doing it too light, where you just want it to be a hint of a reddish pink. And if it ends up being too dark like that, just clean out your brush and grab some yellow and go back over top. And it's okay if your yellow becomes a little brighter, because it is a lot brighter in the image, and it's fine. We could have done the sky second as well, but I kind of wanted you to see how to reactivate your sky. And I'm making it a little uneven, not worrying about it a whole lot. The more you fuss with it, the less it wants to work with you. But we'll add a little bit of blue in the top. And why I'm saying a little is because blue and Crayola palettes tend to be very dominant. And even though it's real dominant in the image, I don't want it to be too crazy, because I don't want a ton of green in the sky, because it will kind of mix with the colors you have and give you a weird tone. And we really just want it to be a nice blue at the very top. And I'm making it a little rounded so it's not perfectly across. And just kind of leave it, let it go, and then come back down to this. Grab your red, it is going to be your next mountain. Allow it to come up into your orange, but you're going to let this be pretty true to color. And what I would do, since this is kind of a purple shade and red goes well with purple, because red and blue become purple, don't feel bad about just kind of covering into your other mountains, because it'll give a good backdrop for you. Again, just do your mountain range. And I'm going a little faster than you have to, so it's fine to just sort of watch what I'm doing and then come back and get the basic gist of what we're having to do, and then see how far you can take it, because you may struggle more with just trying to get the paint out of your palette and doing some mixing. And that's okay, because I've been doing this a lot longer than you potentially, so I can move a little faster. And plus I have sort of the plan in my head. Once you kind of develop your own pieces and have an idea of how color theory works and how you want to mix your colors, you'll be able to do it a lot faster as well, because right now you're just following my plan, and that can always be a little awkward, because some people like to know exactly what they're going to be doing from the get-go, and honestly with art you just can't always have it that way. There will always be some surprise, and it's okay to have mistakes. Just accept your mistakes, because it's going to happen. And honestly, that's how you're going to learn, is by making those mistakes. Okay. So since we've got a great red down, you want to grab, now you can grab the purple in the palette, but you should be able to just grab a little bit of the blue. And I would mix a little bit of this, because blue, mix it with your red to create some purple. Because some of this, especially because of my lights, they're drying the paint a lot faster. And you can always mix a tad on the paper, but especially with this being a little on the waterlogged side at the moment, it may not mix purple right away. So you can always dab some of that blue off. Come back in with your red, and then you'll get more of the shade that's there. And if you do have purple, go ahead and grab the purple and see what it does too. Like, it's definitely a bright, usually in these palettes they're very bright, and we don't really want that. So you want to try to keep the mixes and keep it dark. But if you kind of interchange those purples, you can really show some differences in the mountain ranges. I'm just going to merge those together, because I think that will go a little better with what we're using. And then this very forefront, I would start with your blue and just use it as your dark for now. Because especially in this piece, you want a good base for your dark. But to make it even darker, you can mix some red, like get more red down, get more of your blue. It'll give you a deeper tone. If you add yellow, it will really make it more, it'll darken it, but it'll also make it a little on the green side. So that would just mean you would want to go back in and kind of add more blue to your piece just to keep building your darks. But essentially, this is pretty much what you'll get and keep. If you wanted to make these stand out a bit more, especially if you've gone over it and some of your lines have kind of blurred, you can always go in with a Sharpie or a ballpoint pen and just do a little bit of doodling on top of the dried piece to maybe pull or add a bit more definition to your shapes. But this kind of gives you at least a basic start for just a plain or a very colorful landscape. And it gives you a chance to do some color mixing to get some of the darks or the lights and whatever you are wanting to create. And like I said, depending on your pictures, I would kind of look at more sunsets and things. Those can really be some fun things to mix or paint, or just to mess with. But you can really have some experimentation going with watercolor. This is just sort of a simple, basic piece that is a great landscape to just get some really beautiful color down. But I hope you guys keep experimenting and have a very creative, awesome day. And check me out the next time. Thanks, guys. Bye.